After 38 years of marriage, she planned the perfect retirement party for her husband. Balloons, speeches, smiles. But what no one knew was that she'd discovered his affair with a much younger woman, and in front of everyone, she exposed everything. He thought it was the end of his career. She made sure it was the end of his lies. Subscribe and turn on notifications for new true stories every single day that reveal the lies, the courage, and the justice women deserve. For 36 years, Helen Monroe believed she knew the man she married. She had met Richard when she was just 23, a shy, thoughtful high school English teacher with a dry wit and a deep appreciation for jazz records and quiet evenings. Back then, he was everything she had wanted in a partner: stable, reliable, loyal. They had raised 2 daughters together, bought a modest home in suburban Michigan, and built a life filled with little rituals: Saturday morning pancakes, long walks in the fall, annual camping trips up north. Their life wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and Helen had taken great pride in its rhythm. Now, at 61, Helen was planning Richard's retirement ceremony, a milestone she saw as a shared victory. After 4 decades at the city planning department, he was finally stepping away from the stress, and Helen had thrown herself into organizing the event. She had picked the venue, coordinated with his co-workers, even created a slideshow of memories. It felt like the final chapter of one life and the beginning of another. One they would share, traveling, gardening, maybe even joining that book club she'd always talked about. But something had shifted in Richard over the past year. It was small things at first. He started staying late at work more often, saying he was buried in reports and couldn't make it home for dinner. He stopped listening to their favorite jazz radio station in the kitchen and instead wore wireless earbuds, his playlist a mystery. He began guarding his phone, an object that had once sat untouched on the counter for hours. He kept it in his pocket now, face down on the nightstand, password changed. Helen told herself not to overreact. She was no stranger to the habits of long-term marriage, the silence, the drifting. She chalked it up to retirement anxiety, or maybe just a rough patch. They were getting older after all. Men got irritable, closed off. But then came the absences he couldn't explain, the vague stories that didn't quite line up. A conference in Chicago he hadn't mentioned until the night before. A work dinner where he came home without his jacket, muttering about forgetting it at the restaurant. Still, she waited. Waited for Richard to offer an explanation. Waited for the man she knew to reappear. One Saturday morning, while folding laundry, Helen found a small receipt in the pocket of his slacks. A coffee shop in downtown Detroit, not near his office. Dated last Tuesday, the day he said he had a staff meeting. Scribbled on the back was a name, Kayla, 10 a.m. Helen stared at the name for a long time. It was the kind of name that felt out of place in her world. Young, casual, modern. She didn't know a Kayla, and Richard certainly didn't have any co-workers with that name. Her stomach twisted as she folded the slacks and quietly placed them back into the drawer, tucking the receipt into her robe pocket. For a week, she said nothing. Instead, Helen paid closer attention. She began writing down his comings and goings in a small notebook she kept in her nightstand. She checked their shared credit card statement online each evening, carefully looking at transactions. Small dinners for 2, boutique hotels just outside the city. Nothing extravagant, nothing obvious, but enough to feel like evidence, enough to whisper that her suspicions weren't paranoia. Her eldest daughter, Laura, noticed something was off. "You've been quiet lately, Mom," she said one afternoon as they sat sipping tea on the back porch. "Is everything okay with you and Dad?" Helen hesitated. She had always been private when it came to her marriage. Even through arguments and hard times, she had protected Richard in the eyes of their children. But this time, the words caught in her throat. "I don't know," she finally said. "I think something's changed." Laura didn't press, but her eyes held concern and a growing understanding. It was in the final week before the retirement ceremony that Helen saw it with her own eyes. She had driven to Richard's office, a surprise visit with homemade cookies for his last week. But when she parked and walked toward the building, she saw him just outside the cafe across the street, laughing, with a woman, Kayla. Her long brown hair was pulled into a sleek ponytail, her dress tight and vibrant. She leaned in as she spoke to Richard, who smiled in a way Helen hadn't seen in years. Helen stood frozen on the sidewalk. The cookies in her hand felt suddenly absurd. She turned away before they saw her. She didn't cry, not yet, not then. Instead, Helen drove home, placed the cookies on the kitchen table and opened her notebook. She flipped through the pages, reading her neat handwriting, her collected proof. And then, for the first time in weeks, she made a decision, not out of rage, but resolve. She would not let this moment define her, but she would not let it go unspoken either. She began to plan, not just the retirement party, but how the truth would come out. The evening of Richard's retirement ceremony arrived with an uneasy stillness in the air. Helen stood in front of her bedroom mirror, smoothing down the sleeves of her navy blue dress. It was the same one she had worn to their daughter Laura's wedding 10 years ago. Back then, it had felt like a symbol of hope and joy. Tonight, it felt more like armor. Downstairs, the house buzzed with preparation. Laura had come over early to help transport the decorations and desserts. Helen had insisted on doing everything herself. The catering arrangements, the slideshow, even a framed collage of Richard's achievements over the decades. To the outside world, it was a celebration. But to Helen, it was a stage. She had spent days debating whether to go through with it, whether speaking the truth publicly was the right choice. But every time she imagined herself sitting through the speeches, smiling politely while Richard basked in the admiration of friends and family, the bile rose in her throat. She wasn't doing this to humiliate him. She was doing it to free herself. At the venue, a modest but elegant community center hall, guests trickled in steadily. Former co-workers, longtime friends, distant cousins. Helen moved through them like a gracious hostess, offering polite smiles, nodding along to fond recollections of Richard's years of service. Richard arrived 10 minutes late, his tie slightly crooked, but with his usual charm turned on full force. He hugged old colleagues, shook hands, posed for photos. Helen watched him from across the room, wondering how many of them knew, how many had seen him with her, with Kayla, and then she saw her. Kayla stood near the back of the room, barely noticeable at first. Her hair was down this time, curled loosely. She wore a sleek black dress and held a glass of wine like she belonged there. Helen's breath caught. He had brought her. Not as a date, not officially, but as a guest. Laura followed Helen's gaze. Her eyes narrowed, then widened. "Is that?" Helen gave the smallest nod. Laura's jaw tightened. "You don't have to do this here, Mom. We can leave. We don't owe him anything." Helen placed a steady hand on her daughter's arm. "No," she said. "We're not leaving. Not tonight." As the MC began the ceremony, Helen took her seat near the front, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. Richard took the stage with practiced ease. He gave a short, sentimental speech about dedication, community, and the joy of retiring on his own terms. He thanked Helen, his rock, for standing by him all these years. She watched him, not blinking. When the MC announced that Helen had prepared a surprise slideshow, the lights dimmed. Images of their life together flashed on the screen. Wedding photos, beach vacations, holiday mornings with their girls. The room murmured with warmth, but at the end of the slideshow, just before the final fade-out, Helen had added something extra. A single image, taken 2 weeks ago. A candid photo snapped from across the street. Richard and Kayla, seated outside the cafe, his hand resting on hers. The room gasped. The screen went black. Helen stood slowly, her voice clear and even as the lights came back on. "I thought everyone here deserved to see the full picture." Richard's face drained of color. He stood frozen at the podium, lips parted. "For months now, Richard has been living a double life," Helen said, turning to the guests. "While I planned this celebration, while I baked and organized and honored his career, he was sneaking off with someone half his age, hiding lies behind staff meetings and out-of-town conferences." Someone near the front covered their mouth. The MC fumbled with the microphone, unsure whether to intervene. Helen kept going, calm but full of conviction. "This isn't about revenge. It's about truth. Because I have spent 36 years of my life loving a man who no longer respects me. and I won't protect his secret, just to keep the peace." Richard tried to speak, his voice catching. "Helen, can we talk?" She held up a hand. "We'll talk later, but not here. Not now." Kayla had quietly slipped out the back, unnoticed by most. Helen turned to the audience one last time. "Thank you all for being here tonight. I'm sorry the evening took a turn, but sometimes the truth can't be dressed up for special occasions." And with that, she stepped off the stage. Applause didn't follow, just stunned silence and the sound of her heels on the floor as she walked toward the exit. Laura beside her, hand firmly holding hers. Helen didn't cry. Not yet. But for the first time in months, her shoulders felt light. Helen didn't sleep that night. After the ceremony, she and Laura returned to the house in silence. The quiet wasn't awkward, it was sacred. Laura stayed just long enough to help her mother undress, fold the navy dress back into its box, and make sure she drank a glass of water. Then she kissed her mother's forehead and left, her eyes saying what words could not. Helen lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan as it hummed in slow circles. Her chest ached, not with rage, but with grief. It wasn't the betrayal that cut deepest, it was the years, the sheer weight of time. Decades of birthday cards signed with all my love, quiet meals eaten in habitual rhythm, long winters spent side by side beneath the same roof. What did it all mean now? Was it all a lie? The image of Kayla, youthful, poised, confident, flashed through Helen's mind over and over. It wasn't jealousy she felt. It wasn't even humiliation. It was displacement. Like someone had reached into her carefully built life and erased her, replacing her with a newer model, as if 36 years could be discarded with a few soft lies and secret glances. She rose at 4:30 a.m., pulled on her robe, and padded into the kitchen. The house was still dark, quiet. She didn't turn on the lights, just stood in the familiar space where she had made thousands of breakfasts, packed school lunches, simmered Sunday sauces. Everything looked the same, and yet nothing felt the same. Her phone buzzed. 3 missed calls from Richard, all around midnight. A voicemail. Just his voice, low and unsure. "Please, I didn't expect that. Can we talk?" She deleted it. Around 7, her younger daughter, Rachel, called from out of state. She had seen the fallout on social media. One of the guests had posted about the moment, though without names, saying it was the most courageous thing I've ever witnessed. Helen kept the call short. "I'm okay," she said, though her voice cracked once. "I just need a little time." By mid-morning, the adrenaline had worn off, and the sorrow settled in like fog. Helen didn't cry in loud sobs. Instead, the tears came slow, quiet, steady. They slid down her cheeks as she stood over the sink, rinsing a coffee mug. She didn't even notice them at first. She was mourning something real. Not just Richard's betrayal, but the shared dreams that would never materialize, the future vacations, the golden years spent side by side, the companionship she had counted on. In the afternoon, she finally sat down with her notebook, the one where she had documented the clues, the receipts, the strange stories. Each entry had been a tiny rebellion against her own denial. She read them over now, this time not with suspicion, but with clarity. Each lie had been a thread, unraveling the life she had stitched together with care. She closed the notebook. This wasn't about fixing anything anymore. It was about letting go. Helen took a long shower, letting the water scald her skin. Later that evening, she opened the old cedar chest in her closet. It held their wedding album, old love letters, anniversary cards. She went through them slowly, not in bitterness, but with reverence. The past wasn't meaningless. It was real, at least to her. But it was over now. She packed it all into a large box and taped it shut. Not out of anger, but out of need. She needed space. She needed air. She needed to make room for a version of herself that existed beyond Richard. That night, Laura returned to sleep over. They curled up on the couch watching an old black and white movie, one they'd watched a dozen times before. Helen didn't talk much, but at one point she reached out and held her daughter's hand. "I think I need to talk to a lawyer," she said softly. Laura nodded. "Whatever you need, I'm with you." Helen's eyes welled up again, but this time the tears weren't just sorrow. They were also strength. She had survived the worst night of her life, Now she would survive what came next. Richard didn't show up the next day. Helen expected that. She had humiliated him after all, in front of friends, co-workers, family, but she hadn't done it for revenge. She had done it for herself. Still, she knew Richard well enough to know that silence wouldn't last. He called again that evening, then the next morning, and again after dinner. Finally, on the third day, Helen answered. "Hi," he said, voice low, hesitant. "Can we talk? In person?" Helen considered saying no, but something inside her, maybe curiosity, maybe closure, said yes. He arrived that afternoon, same familiar knock, same heavy footsteps on the porch. When she opened the door, he looked smaller somehow, not physically, but diminished, as if the performance had ended, and all that was left was the man behind the curtain. He sat stiffly on the edge of the living room couch, the same one they had picked out together 20 years ago during a Labor Day sale. Helen didn't offer him coffee. He started with the expected, "I'm sorry." Silence stretched between them like a rope about to snap. "I didn't mean for it to go that far. It just happened." Helen raised an eyebrow. "It just happened? Like a spilled drink?" He winced. "That's not what I meant. I've been under a lot of pressure this year, wrapping up the job, the retirement stuff, and I don't know. Kayla was just someone I could talk to. She made me feel seen. You and we've been more like roommates lately." Helen didn't flinch. She had heard some version of this script before, from movies, from friends, from stories whispered at church luncheons. "It wasn't just emotional, Richard. Don't insult both of us." He leaned forward, elbows on knees. "I never stopped loving you. I swear. I didn't mean to hurt you." She laughed then, bitter and short. "You never stopped loving me. Is that what love looks like to you? Sneaking around? Lying to my face while I planned your retirement celebration?" "I panicked," he said quickly. "When I saw that photo up on the screen, I felt like my world collapsed." Helen folded her arms. "Your world? Your world? Do you have any idea what the last 6 months have been like for me? Watching you leave the house at odd hours, pretending everything was normal, feeling like I was losing my mind. You made me feel like a fool. I didn't know how to end it," he murmured. "She was young, yes, but she didn't mean anything long-term. I wasn't going to leave you, Helen. You already did," she said. "You left the moment you decided I wasn't enough." The room pulsed with a heavy silence. Richard reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, a handwritten letter. He pushed it toward her across the coffee table. "I wrote this the night after the ceremony. I was trying to figure out what to say. I know I can't undo what I did, but I wanted you to know I'm willing to fix this." Helen didn't touch the letter. "You don't fix betrayal," she said. "You rebuild after it, if you're lucky, and I don't think we're lucky anymore." His eyes filled then, not with performative tears, but with something closer to shame. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. "I miss you," he finally said. "I miss our life." Helen looked at him, not the man she had married, but the man who sat before her now. Older, yes. Regretful, perhaps, but not the man she once shared dreams with. "I miss our life too," she said softly. "But it's gone, Richard. You let it go. I just finally caught up to the truth." She stood, signaling the end of the conversation. Richard remained seated for a beat longer, as if hoping she'd change her mind. Then he rose slowly. Before he left, he turned at the door. "If there's any chance, any at all, I want to fight for this." Helen met his eyes with steady grace. "There's no fight left? Not from me." He nodded once, and then quietly, he left. Helen didn't cry. She didn't feel relief either. Not yet. What she felt was a slow unbinding, like a thread, pulling free from a knot that had been tightening for years. Helen didn't make the decision in a fit of anger. It came the way most life-altering decisions do, not all at once, but gradually, like the tide easing its way up the shoreline, quiet, inevitable. The morning after Richard's visit, she woke to the sound of birds outside the bedroom window. The same bird song she'd heard for years, but it sounded different now, like a reminder that the world kept moving, even when your heart felt stuck in place. She made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and opened her planner. For a few minutes, she stared at the empty week ahead. No dinners to plan, no anniversary trip to arrange. Just space, unscheduled and unfamiliar. And for the first time in a long time, that didn't feel lonely. It felt like possibility. At 10:15, she called a local law firm. The receptionist was warm but efficient. "We can get you in tomorrow morning, Mrs. Sterling." "Is this regarding a divorce?" Helen hesitated for just a breath, then answered with quiet conviction. "Yes, yes it is." After the call, she didn't cry. She didn't shake. She simply sat back in the chair and took a long sip of her now lukewarm coffee. This was the right thing. Not because she was angry, but because she was done. Done waiting for him to become the man she had built her life around. Done hoping the betrayal would turn out to be a misunderstanding. Done living like a footnote in her own story. Later that day, she drove to the storage unit they had rented a decade ago. The one where they kept old boxes of family photos, Richard's college memorabilia, the girls' school art projects. She didn't go to reminisce. She went to gather what was hers. Helen worked with a kind of quiet efficiency. She separated her keepsakes from his. Wedding mementos, shared journals, old Christmas cards. She packed everything she wanted to keep into the back of her car and left the rest. By the time she got home, the sun was starting to set, casting golden light across the kitchen floor. She stood there for a while, watching dust particles float in the air. Then she took out a legal pad and began to make a list. Call financial advisor, locate tax returns, change emergency contact at the doctor's office, find a support group or counselor. It wasn't a revenge list. It was a rebuild list. When Laura came by that evening to check on her, Helen greeted her at the door with a small smile. Not the kind that says "I'm fine," but the kind that says "I'm finding my footing." "I called a lawyer," she said. Laura's expression softened. "Are you sure you're ready?" Helen nodded. "I don't know if anyone's ever ready, but I'm certain it's time." They sat on the couch, the same place where just days ago Helen had whispered that her world was unraveling. Now she spoke with clarity. "I thought about staying," she admitted, "for the sake of history, for the sake of the girls, for the sake of not having to start over at this stage in life. But then I thought, if I stay, what am I teaching myself? That betrayal is tolerable. That loyalty means endurance, no matter how much it costs me?" Laura nodded, eyes full. "I deserve better than silence," Helen said. "Better than excuses. I may be nearing retirement, but I'm not retiring from self-respect." That night, she slept more soundly than she had in weeks. Not because the pain was gone, but because her decision had been made. She wasn't waiting anymore. She wasn't hoping for things to return to what they once were. She was moving forward. The next morning, she arrived at the law office 10 minutes early. The waiting room was quiet, filled with soft music and the scent of lemon-scented polish. The receptionist smiled as Helen filled out the intake forms. When the lawyer, a kind woman in her 50s named Cynthia Palmer, came to greet her, Helen stood up and extended her hand. "I'm not here to ruin him," Helen said once they were seated in the consultation room. "I'm here to protect what's mine, and to start again, with dignity." Cynthia nodded, meeting her eyes. "Then you're in the right place." As they began to go over the necessary paperwork, Helen felt the weight on her chest begin to lift, just slightly. There would be more hard days ahead, lawyers, finances, family conversations, but the hardest part was already behind her. She had decided. She was reclaiming her life. The sun was just beginning to dip when Helen pulled into the quiet cafe parking lot. She'd chosen this place deliberately, neutral ground, public but not crowded, familiar but not sentimental. She sat for a moment in the driver's seat, watching her own reflection in the rearview mirror. She looked tired, yes, but she also looked clear-eyed, clean, like someone who had laid down a heavy burden and refused to pick it back up. Richard was already inside when she walked in. He stood as she approached, a reflex from another life. She didn't offer a hug. "Thanks for meeting," he said, sitting back down. Helen nodded politely, folding her hands in front of her. "Let's keep this brief." He looked like he hadn't been sleeping well. Sunken eyes, shoulders a little too hunched for a man who used to command boardrooms. She noticed, but she didn't feel sorry. "I've been thinking," he began, "about what you said, about how much I hurt you. I've had time to reflect, and I just want to say again how sorry I am. I know that doesn't fix anything." It doesn't, she agreed, her tone flat but not cruel. But I'm not here for apologies. He blinked. Then what are you here for? I'm here to tell you what comes next. She reached into her bag and laid a manila envelope on the table between them. Inside were copies of the divorce papers, neatly labeled, organized, efficient, just like everything Helen had ever managed in their life together. He hesitated. You've already filed? Yes, she said. Last week. A flicker of something crossed his face. Maybe surprise, maybe grief, but she didn't indulge it. And I wanted this meeting so we could be clear, she continued. No back and forth, no what-ifs, no slow unravel. We had a long run, Richard. A marriage with good years and hard years. But the moment you brought someone else into it without my knowledge, you ended it. I made a mistake, he said quietly. Helen tilted her head. Number A mistake is locking your keys in the car. What you did was a choice, repeated choices, lies layered on top of lies. I was afraid, he said. Afraid of getting older, of feeling invisible. Kayla made me feel like I mattered again. Helen took a deep breath, not because she was about to cry, but because she wasn't. You think I haven't felt invisible? She asked. You think I didn't notice when you stopped looking at me like I mattered? When you left me alone to manage the house, the kids, the holidays? Like I was just the background crew to your main event? He swallowed, but said nothing. I gave you decades, Richard. I gave you my loyalty, my time, my belief in who we were, and you gave pieces of yourself to someone young enough to be your daughter. His face flushed. She doesn't even want anything serious. It's already over. Helen smiled then. A soft, sad smile. It's not about her, she said. It's about you. And it's about me finally understanding that I don't have to spend the rest of my life mourning someone who was already gone. He reached for her hand across the table. She pulled hers back. I want this to be civil, she said. I've outlined fair terms. You'll see them in the documents. I'm not interested in dragging this out. What about the girls? He asked. They're grown, she said. And they already know. You'll have to rebuild that trust on your own. He looked away then, out the cafe window. A couple in their 30s laughed at a patio table, clinking glasses. Life going on, unbothered. Helen rose from her seat and gathered her purse. This is the last time we'll have a conversation like this, she said, her voice firm but gentle. The next time we speak, it will be through our attorneys. He stood too, but made no move to follow her. Maybe he finally understood that it was over, that she was no longer holding space for him in her future. As she turned to leave, he said softly, I never thought it would end like this. Helen paused just long enough to respond. Neither did I, she said. But it's not the end of my story, just the end of yours in it. She walked out into the warm evening air, the door's bell tinkling behind her, and didn't look back. The divorce was finalized on a crisp Monday morning in late March. Helen didn't wear black or gray or anything somber. She wore a soft blue dress with a delicate floral scarf, subtle, elegant, and wholly her. The courtroom was small and impersonal, with pale walls and buzzing fluorescent lights, but she carried herself like she was walking into something sacred. Her attorney, Cynthia, gave her a reassuring nod as the judge read through the agreement. Everything had been handled quietly. The house was hers, the accounts were split fairly, and Helen had insisted on keeping her name. She'd earned it. Richard sat across from her, avoiding her gaze. He looked diminished, not humiliated, but quietly aware that he had lost something bigger than a marriage. When the judge signed the final document, Helen felt a breath leave her body that she hadn't even realized she was holding. It was done, not with fireworks or a dramatic scene, just ink on paper, the end of a chapter. Outside the courthouse, Cynthia patted her arm. You handled this with more grace than most people I've seen, she said. Helen smiled, a little weary but genuinely grateful. I wasn't interested in dragging him through the mud. I just wanted to be free, and that's what justice looked like for her. Not punishment, but freedom. That afternoon, she drove to the beach. The sky was wide and open, the waves steady and sure. She walked along the shoreline barefoot, letting the cold water sting her ankles. It reminded her that she was alive, that she was still capable of feeling everything: pain, peace, hope.